is describing the entity. And the second word, knowing or awareness, is the function. What does the mind do? So this word, the fact that the mind is clear or has clarity, implies two things. One is that the mind is not physical, so the mind is not the brain, it's not an emergent property of the brain, it's not a function of the brain. And the second understanding of the word clear or clarity is that because the mind is clear or has clarity, means therefore things can appear in the mind. Thoughts, emotions and so forth can appear in the mind. And then what's the function of the mind? What does the mind do? It knows, it is aware. So the mind engages in those appearances. So now, of course, these two attributes of the mind, for us, are not very obvious. Because now our mind is agitated, it's distracted and so forth. It's a little bit like the analogy of, if we have a container of water with a lot of sediment and we shake it up, then water by nature is clear. But if you have a lot of sediment and shake up the water, you won't see that clarity of the water. All you'll see is dirt. So even though the nature of water is clear, we don't see it. Similarly, even though the nature of mind is clear, we don't see it because our mind is agitated with all sorts of mental afflictions and emotions and so forth. But if we do this shamatha practice, that would be like putting that container down and let it settle. Then the sediment will slowly sink to the bottom and then suddenly we'll see the clear water. Similarly, if we do shamatha practice, all this agitation, mental afflictions and so forth and distractions will settle and we'll start to really see the clear nature of the mind, the clarity of the mind. And also we'll be able to directly see the knowing or the awareness aspect, that the mind really knows it is aware. Now, of course, that's obscured by all of these things as well. So that's what it's saying here, is that just focus on the mind in shamatha practice, and if you do, you'll really start to experience these two attributes of the mind more and more as you focus better and better on the mind. Now it says there's two ways to do this here at the bottom paragraph of page 4. It says, when observing in this way, whatever thoughts arise, simply recognize each one. So one approach is, we're watching the mind, and we're talking shamatha here now, of course. And of course, thoughts... and here in the text, when you see the word thought, often that's a generic term, which just actually means conceptual activity. So here, when we see the word thought, it doesn't just mean thinking. It means all conceptual activity, meaning thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. All of that here is thoughts or conceptual activity. So we are to watch all of that conceptual activity in the mind. Our thoughts, our emotions, our mental images, memories. One thing to do is just watch them, just recognize them. So when something comes up, you go, oh, and you just watch it arise and pass, arise and pass. That's one approach. The second approach here says, alternatively, just like a swordsman's battle with the archer taught in the Vinaya scriptures, having generated strong mindfulness and introspection, as soon as any thought arises, cut it off completely, not allowing it to continue. So a second approach with observing the mind is, again, the first one is when a thought comes, just watch it arise and pass. The second one is cut it off. But cut it off doesn't mean block it. You can't block them. Cut it off means don't pay any attention to it. So the second approach is we are simply resting in the mind itself and we're not paying any attention to anything that comes up in the mind. Like if sometimes we use the analogy of the mind is the sky and thoughts are like the clouds moving through the sky. So the first approach would be a thought comes, you watch it as it passes through the mind. The second approach is you're just watching the sky of the mind. The clouds are moving through, but it doesn't matter. You're not interested in them. You're not trying to block any thoughts. They'll come through, but all we're doing is we're just paying attention to the sky of the mind itself. So that's often the shamatha practice, what's called resting in awareness.
Can I ask something?
Sure.
Can you choose yourself in which way to go, or the teacher is doing?
The question was, sorry?
You choose by yourself to watch the thought or leave it, or the teacher guides you to do it?
Right. So remember here, we saw over the last page is that there are many different objects we can use in the shamatha practice. And the general recommendation is use the object that works best for you. So therefore we can be introduced to the various objects, the breath, observing thoughts, resting in awareness, maybe a mental image of a Buddha, many different objects. And then we practice each one for a little while and we think, okay, this one seems to be one I resonate with, I'm going to go with that one. So therefore we can choose. And of course, if we've got a teacher, they can help us to make maybe a better choice on that. So if we go over the page, on page 5, then I just want to briefly mention this, because then it's soon time for morning tea, because after the morning tea break, I want to do this shamatha practice, because remember, shamatha is the basis of vipassana. So we need to have a bit of shamatha basis before we leap into vipassana. And so what I'd like to do after the break is this shamatha practice of the second variation, of cutting off thoughts, meaning just not interested. We're just interested in awareness. But I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. But I just want to mention 2 points first. On page 5, then, it talks about some things to do, how to practice this, what to do when dullness and distraction come in. And it's all about sort of tightening and loosening. That if we find that we're really falling into dullness, we sharpen our attention. If we're getting a bit agitated and distracted, we relax a little bit more. So it's always this sharpening and loosening and just watching and not fighting with the mind. And this is very nicely summarised here, this quote towards the bottom of page 5 by Yang Gompa. And he says, "Do not view discursive thoughts as false." So in this practice, thoughts are not problems. We're not trying to get rid of thoughts. We're not trying to make the mind still. And he says, do not intentionally cultivate non-conception. Again, don't try to make the mind still in this practice. If there's thoughts there, that's fine. If there's no thoughts there, that's fine. They're both fine. We're not trying to get rid of thoughts. He says, all you do is settle the mind in its natural state and keep a distant watch. And the meditation will arrive at shamatha. So all we need to do is step back and watch the mind. That's all we need to do. We're not trying to make it still, fight with thoughts or suppress them or anything. Just step back and watch. And then over the page, then the last page 6 is where we finished last 2 years ago, down towards the bottom of page 6. We saw there that this shamatha, this developing this single point of concentration, is the basis of all the vipassana practice, because without shamatha we won't be able to fully penetrate nature of reality. We won't be able to come to a direct insight into emptiness because our mind is not stable and clear enough. So therefore, the more effort we put into shamatha, the more stable and clear and focused our mind becomes, the easier vipassana practice will be, and the more we'll be able to penetrate, the more we'll come to some experience of emptiness and be able to hold that experience longer. So that's something very important, because I think in a lot of the modern day Buddhist traditions, this shamatha practice sort of gets largely left out. You know, a lot of people go into vipassana, but then they wonder why they're not getting anywhere. And it's usually because they're distracted and dull and not very focused. So we need to make sure that if we want our Vipassana practice to be effective, then we need to have a basis in shamatha, as we've seen here in this progression. Because unless we train that coarse mind and make it more subtle, then you'll find it's going to be very difficult to do any sort of Vipassana practice. So what I'd like to do after the break, and maybe I'll spend a few minutes now explaining the practice so that when we get back from the break we'll launch straight into it. So again, Mahamudra is about realising the ultimate nature of the mind, to realise emptiness with respect to the mind. So that's the focus of today and tomorrow. But of course the shamatha is the basis of that, and so what we're going to do is we're going to use the mind as the object of shamatha, and we're going to use the second variation of the two variations mentioned here. And so I'd just like to mention a few things about that now before we take a break. So if we're using the breath as the object of shamatha, then we are aware of the sensations of the breath. If we're doing the first variation here, we're observing our thoughts and emotions and so forth, we are aware of our thoughts and emotions and so forth that are coming up. This second variation, the one we're going to do now after the break, is what we're doing is we're turning awareness in upon itself. And we're just knowing that we're aware. Many people find this very challenging, not because it's complicated, but actually because it's too simple. It's too simple. Because basically this involves doing nothing. We don't know how to do nothing. We always want to do something. So when this is explained, people often go, yeah, but what am I supposed to do? Tell me what I've got to do. Doing is the problem. Stop doing. This practice is more about being. So all this practice is simply know that you're aware. That's it. That's all you got to do. Know that you're aware. Of course, all sorts of things will come up still, thoughts, emotions, memories and so forth, but as the instruction here said to, on the bottom of page 4, as soon as any thought arises, cut it off completely, not allowing it to continue. Cut it off again doesn't mean suppress it. That's not going to work. Cut it off means don't pay any attention to it whatsoever. So all sorts of things will come up, thoughts and emotions. In this practice, let them be there. They can be there. We're just not interested in them. We're just interested in the sky of the mind. That's all. We're just interested in knowing we're aware. That's it. That's the practice. With this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open, either naturally or partially. There are a number of reasons for that. One is that with the eyes open, it helps to improve clarity. With eyes closed, it's much easier to drift into dullness. With the eyes open, it's much easier to stay in the present moment. With the eyes closed, it's much easier to drift off into the past and the future. Also, with the eyes open, that will help us to bring this into daily life. Because also in daily life, we'd like to be able to rest in awareness in daily life. But if we've only ever practiced that with eyes closed, then in daily life when we generally have our eyes open, it's going to be hard to do it because we're not familiar with that. Whereas if we do this practice with eyes open, then we can more easily bring this into daily life. So that's the third reason. And the fourth reason, particularly related here, is with the eyes closed, there's very much a strong sense of a me in here and a world out there. So there's quite a strong sense of duality, subject-object duality. Whereas if we do this practice with eyes open, this false sense of duality starts to break down. And that's going to be very helpful when we go into Vipassana practice, because in Vipassana, here, we're coming to realise there is no duality. There's no subject-object duality. So already in shamatha, if we're already weakening that through having the eyes open, that's going to be helpful. So that's going to be the recommendation in the meditation we're going to do after the break. But if you've never meditated with your eyes open and you find that awkward, then you can close them. But I would recommend to learn how to do this practice with the eyes open. Any questions about the practice before we take a morning tea break? Because after we come back, we'll go straight into the practice.
I'm just not sure if we are focusing on the breath or just...
Just know you're aware. That's it. If you're focusing on any appearance, the breath, a thought, a sound, you're distracted. All we're doing in this practice is just know that you're aware. Whatever's coming up, let it be there. We're just not interested. Sounds can stay there. Thoughts can stay there. Don't pay them any attention. Just know that you're aware. That's it. So simple. Simple but not easy.
We're not trying to locate the feeling of awareness. Right?
That's Vipassana. That's Vipassana practice. So remember, the meditation we're going to do after the break is not Vipassana. So in this practice, if a thought comes up, where is this awareness? Ignore it. That's Vipassana practice. We're not doing that yet. That comes later. Whatever comes up, just ignore it. Okay.
How do you make the difference between ignore it to
Suppress it.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's so...
Exactly. The difference between ignoring and suppressing is if we can get into a state of mind having no preference. If you can get into a state of mind of having no preference, if there's no thoughts there or there's heaps of thoughts there, both equally okay. Good thoughts, bad thoughts, equally okay. If you can get into this state of, I don't care if there's nothing there, I don't care if there's bad thoughts there or good thoughts there, they're all okay. Everything's okay, that will help.
Don't listen to the story of the thought.
No. Leave the story there. We're just not interested. We're not interested in any stories. Okay, let's take a morning tea break. Come back at 11:45. Sorry.